Hey guys, Quickcaster here, and today we're going to talk about the Waker class, specifically the skill tree, and kind of how to build it, what these class skills do, and how they are. So first up, we have Harmonizer Focus. This is kind of like the main meat of what the Waker is, where it gives you focus gauges for your corresponding familiars for Fredrin and Wolfen, which is the ranged and melee familiar, respectively. So then basically when you get this, you get 2 stocks for each of those, and you can use photon arts with those familiars to increase the gauge. The importance of the gauge is actually because of this familiar harmony ability, which is an active skill that you put on like your sub palette or your weapon palette, where you can launch linked attacks with both Fredrin and Wolfen, consuming a stock of each of their gauges. Basically, with this ability, you can do lots of damage as long as you're using both Fredrin and Wolfen to build their gauges, because as you can see over here, they can do 600 potency damage with just the one attack. So you want to get this up as much as possible. And then along with this down here, whenever you use this harmony or like consume focus gauge, so there might be more abilities in the future, but whenever you use harmony, you can get PP consumption reduction for your photon arts dealing with these familiars. So when you put points into this, it is always 90% PP consumption, so it reduces it by 10. But basically putting more points into it increases the duration of this effect. But if you max this skill out, it goes up to a 20-second duration instead of just 10 seconds with a single point. So it's kind of up to you, though, if you want to actually put full points into this, because every time you use Harmony, this effect happens. You can definitely get Harmony charged before this 20-second window. So if you kind of feel comfortable switching back and forth between Fredrin and Wolfen, then you might not need all the points and maybe can just go like 3 points instead. But for me personally, I just like to put all points into this because it kind of just like makes me feel like that safety window. So just in case I do screw up not building harmony enough in that window. But next we move on to another important part of the tree is treble clef marking. This is where you hit your enemies several times with your photon arts and it'll cause them to be marked. You have like a little symbol on them. And then these marked enemies take more damage and their down factor is increased. So when you grab this skill, it increases the potency by 3% and your down factor for both physical and elemental by 20%. But this skill itself is a little bit misleading. This doesn't increase the damage of all of your attacks, and it doesn't increase the damage of, say, other weapons if you like multi-weapons or like switch weapons when the mark is still active. This potency is only increasing your photon arts for the harmonizer, so like Fredrin and Wolfen's abilities. And then for the down factor, Harmonizer by itself currently can only do physical down factor. So it actually doesn't even help out in the elemental down factor quite yet until we can get elemental harmonizers. But regardless, this is still helpful for your harmonizer, just doing extra potency and down factor. But even compounds more with these other class skills further down the tree. With Treble Clef Ignition, you can hold down the normal attack that you have with Harmonizer, and hitting a marked enemy with that, the mark will detonate. This by itself is actually not good because you're getting rid of your mark up here, so it's like taking away that down factor and damage. But because of this skill down below, Familiar Support, it's actually very good. So what Familiar Support does is when you activate this ignition or explode this mark, you will generate a crest or like a little sigil or turret next to your character, which emits attacks every so often. The type of attack varies depending on which familiar you use, Fredrin or Wolfen. And you can tell by that by having a red one on your right side or a blue one on your left side. So based on which familiar's crest you summon, so like Fredrin is blue, that will give you blue gauge or Fredrin's gauge once it starts hitting enemies. The same for Wolfen on the other side. And with these, they last for 20 seconds, and you only can have one up at a time, so you can't have both Fredrin and Wolfen giving you extra shots and giving you gauge for both of those bars. But you can use, say, Fredrin's PAs while you have a Wolfen crest up, so you can build both of the gauges at the same time, kind of working towards that harmony use. And then there's one last thing that kind of attaches to this familiar support, is called Familiar Support Amplifier. So what this amplifier does is each time you activate a familiar support again while it's already active, that familiar's focus gauge increases for a set time. This increase can be 50% or 100%. So if you can reactivate it twice when it's already active, then you get that 100% boost rate. But this boost applies to your familiar support skill and to the PAs depending on which crest you have. So it can boost the Fredrin's PAs when you have a Fredrin crest active, and then vice versa for the Wolfen one. So if you really wanted to double down on a single familiar's focus gauge, then you would be using like Wolfen's PAs at the same time as having a Wolfen crest up with this skill. And then a couple neat things with this as well is that like if you switch from one crest or another, it continues to amplify the other. So if you use the Fredrin thing at its base, and then you switch over to Wolfen, then that Wolfen will have an amplifier on it. Then you can tell when something is being amplified by a slight purple hue to said crest. Usually it's just like a red, and then it turns into more of a purple, and then at 100% it's even like more purple to where it's almost completely that color. Up next, we move to the third familiar, Marmelo. So with its first skill is Marmelo Strike. So negating a certain number of attacks with the weapon action will cause Marmelo to grow up to 2 times. So you press and hold the weapon action to throw Marmelo to cause an explosion based on the stage that it is on. When you put a point into this, you can see here that the potency for a no charge, so just throwing it by default, is a 400 potency attack. And then at stage 1 is 800. And then at stage 2, it's a whopping 2000 potency. The number of times required to actually get to these stages, you have to guard 1 time with stage 1, but 3 times with stage 2. That actually might be kind of different from situation to situation. So if you're able to get in a whole bunch of hits, and not really be attacked much, then you could probably do stage 1 quite often for those continuous 800 hits. Because, 3 of those blocks could be, 800, 1600, and then 2400, so overall more potency than the stage 2. But with that, it kind of takes longer since you're doing each attack individually, so you might just want to save up for the stage 2 at the 2000 potency for, say, when an enemy is down, or if they're broken. But you guys definitely want to pick this up if you guys are maining Waker. And along with this comes some more abilities attached to it. For one that's pretty simple is Marmelo Strike Tracing. This just lets the throwing ability or the strike home in on enemies instead of just going out in a straight line. But then we have another ability with this Marmelo called Hot Marmelo Parry. This is another active skill with Waker, where when you use it, enemy attacks are negated without interrupting your own attacks. What this means is that when you're attacking with, say, PAs, normal attacks, etc., you can use this ability on the in-between to have Marmelo pop out by itself instead of you using the weapon action. It has kind of the same duration as that, but it also comes with a 10-second cooldown. But this cooldown can be reduced with the Hot Marmelo Parry Short Cooldown skill. So the cooldown time for this active skill is reduced when you successfully avoid an attack with it. It reduces the cooldown by 5 seconds. But this skill is actually pretty misleading with its description, because you might be thinking when you successfully parry an attack with it, then it reduces the cooldown. But actually how it works is if you use the skill and it doesn't parry anything, or like the enemy misses, then the cooldown is reduced. But because of this though, this active skill is actually pretty spammable. So if you like misuse it, then you'll just have a short cooldown. But if you actually do use it, then it just has the regular cooldown, but it's still only 10 seconds, which isn't that long. But this is definitely something that you want on your sub palette if you are going to main Waker. This can save you in a lot of situations, as lots of the PAs and the different attacks have animation lock, so you can't use the weapon action all the time. And instead, you would use this active skill. But speaking of these weapon actions and parries, there's actually a couple skills that go along with this as well. Harmonizer Parry Counter. So when you use the weapon action to negate damage, then you can press the normal attack to successfully unleash a counter attack. So just like a high damaging normal attack that's like about 4 to 5 times more damage as it would normally be. So if you are familiar with the Hunter's Sword counter, this works exactly the same as that. But also with the parrying, if you successfully negate an attack with the weapon action, then you can recover some photon power, which is 20 photon power, which is actually pretty huge. Once again, this is with the weapon action for both of these and does not include the Hot Marmelo Parry. For the last of the skills, though, with Harmonizer, we have Linear Drive and Linear Drive Encore. So what Linear Drive does is you move forward at high speed and attack by pressing the normal attack button at just the right time after a photon art. Pressing back on the directional pad will cause you to retreat. This linear drive is actually pretty similar to the fighter's acceleration drive for daggers, but instead of just going towards the enemy, you can actually go forwards or backwards depending on the direction you're using. And then for this encore, this just actually lets you do it a second time after your previous linear drive. So you get an additional purple glow after you use the first one. I would actually highly recommend using these skills because this can close the gap for when you want to use Wolfen or you want to kind of back up when you want to use Fredrin. Definitely good for positioning across the fields. That is all of the skills for the Harmonizer, kind of all the things branching for that. So if you're Waker, I would just basically recommend grabbing all of these. If you're just subclassing but still want to use Waker, then I would grab everything but the Marmelo stuff because that is main class only. But then we get onto some of the more confusing parts of this tree, at least for me, was these passive skills. So for the first one here, we have Retro Friends Rescue. It says here that you have a chance of recovering HP when your HP drops a certain percentage below your max. So when you put points into this, this is what you get: 30% activation probability, 30% HP recovery rate for your main class, and then the probability and recovery rate change if you subclass this, and then it has a cooldown of 30 seconds, and the activation damage is 40%. Dumping more points into this actually just increases the activation probability of this happening up to 75%. So at first I thought this skill was when you go down to 40% of your max HP, then this has a chance of happening up to the 75% chance, and then it would heal you that 30% or 15% HP as it says here. But that's not actually how this skill works. It's if you take 40% of your max HP in one hit, then this can proc for you. You can tell this happening if the different familiars start floating around you in a little bit of a glow, and then they heal you for this 30% or 15% HP. So to give an example, if you were at 500 max HP and took over 200 damage in a single hit, which is 40% of that 500 number, then this has a chance of proccing. But if you're going to die from said hits, like go to 0, then this does not have a chance of saving you like Hunter's Iron will. You heal after the fact, not before or like during. Moving on to the next skill though is Welfare Management. This reduces damage taken and increases your Resta sign heal amount when your HP drops below a certain percentage. This actually works in opposite of the Retro Friends Rescue. So if you hit 30% activation HP or 30% of your max, then you get these benefits. So it reduces your damage based on the main and sub here, and then also the heal potency based on maining or subbing this class. So pumping more points into this actually just reduces the amount of damage you take. So 60% of the damage or 80% for sub, and then it's always 125% heal potency for main and 110% for subclass. But then we have an interesting passive effect called the Resta effect Continuance. So when using a Resta sign, the amount of HP you recover is reduced, but you gain sustained HP recovery for a set time. So what this means when you put points into this, it reduces how much your burst heal of your Resta does, but then it gives you heal over time based off of your max HP. So putting 1 point to this, if you're maining, you get 1% of your max HP every second for 10 seconds. Pumping more points into this actually decreases the amount of recovery that you get from your burst with the Resta, but it keeps increasing that max HP recovery amount the further and further you go in by 0.5% for main and 0.4 for the subclass. When you get up to max here, it's 50% halved for both your main and sub, but the HP recovery gets up to 5.5% of your max HP every second and 4% for a subclass. This skill itself came with a lot of questions. Like, does the HP recovery rate have for absolutely everything? From what I saw, it only halves the burst for the Resta just for yourself. It does not affect Resta field if you have it from Tector or Force. It doesn't affect this recovery rate here at all. doesn't really affect like anything else but your own burst healing of your Resta. Included into the Resta field, it also does not carry over this heal over time. This heal over time is just for yourself as well. But then another weird thing along with this skill is that when you get topped off by this heal over time, it stops. Even if it's just like 2 seconds of healing, the duration would still continue. You get topped off, it's done. So say you heal for 2 seconds, you got max HP, you get hit, like 1 second later, it's not going to heal that hit anymore. So it's kind of like a weird niche use thing. So like if you're continuously taking small hits, this could be useful, but I don't see it actually being used for much gameplay. So for me personally, I don't really put many points into this. I usually put like 5 or less. It's kind of just like up to you how much you want. But then for the last skill here, we have Lucky Sign. When you use Resta or Reverse Sign, there's a chance that they will not be consumed. So basically putting points to this increases the chance of that happening from 10% all the way up to 20%. So this is a nice skill when it does happen, but because it's such a low probability, it's kind of hard to say whether this is good or not. If you are running Geolab, for instance, this actually refunds all of your Resta or Reverse Assign if you have that modifier that costs extra. So it can be very good for that. Or if there's certain activities where you're using a lot of revives and this happens to proc, that can also be very nice to get an extra revive in. So I would say for endgame activities, this can be good, but just don't rely on this skill at all. So if you want to put points into this, you can, but you can also skip this skill if you don't care for this probability of this ability. But the way I personally build my skill tree is I put points into all these things, like I said before. And then for the passives here, I put 6 into Retro Friends Rescue and 5 into Resta Effect Continuance, and I just max these other 2. Like I said, you can take a couple points out of here, maybe you can take points out of here to kind of put into these spots, or you can kind of make these interchangeable. If you don't care about the Resta Effect Continuance, put more into here, or don't care about this, can put more into here. It's kind of like a switch between these passive skills mostly. But now that we have the Waker class out of the way, you may be wondering what kind of subclass goes along with Waker. There's actually kind of 3 options that I think are good, which is Bouncer, Fighter, and Force. The reason for Bouncer is because of this defeat amplifier, which can increase your down factor against enemies, which kind of just compounds with the Treble Clef mark, so you can get that extra down factor in and getting those enemies down as fast as possible. But also with Bouncer, you can get increased damage based on the number of parts you destroy on a single enemy. So this can also be very useful for that. And if you like to use Jet Boots along with Waker, you can take skills for that as well, because it's very good for that down damage. Fighter is good as well, though, for this defeat advantage and defeat PP recovery, because this actually increases damage against downed enemies and increases PP recovery when attacking downed enemies. So if you feel like with Bouncer's part break damage skill that you can't really get that enough with the enemies you're facing, or you're already getting enough downs to take more advantage of this, then I would go with Fighter. And then for Force, this is actually very good for mobbing or like combat areas. With this eradication PP gain, you get PP recovery every time you kill something or down something. And then also the natural PP recovery, so just over time, you're getting more and more. And take advantage of PP conversion, just very nice. You're getting a whole bunch of PP to go from mob to mob. And then if you wanted to do techniques as Harmonizer cannot, you can use a Rod or Talus to do that elemental damage. Once again, that mark does not increase elemental down factor for other weapons, just Harmonizer, just so you're aware. That's all I have for you guys on this Waker skill tree and how to build it. If you're a new player, though, I would recommend going for these skills down here first, as they're kind of like your more active skills, so you can kind of learn it throughout the game, and then you can worry about these passive skills up here later. But let me know what you guys think of the Waker's different skills, maybe how you built it differently in the comments down below. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.